I remember the exact temperature of that July night. Not hot enough to justify the restlessness that kept me awake, but warm enough that the thin sheet felt heavy against my skin. The apartment held the day's heat like a secret, releasing it slowly through cracked windows that let in nothing but the distant hum of late-night traffic. I had been lying there for hours, watching shadows move across the ceiling, when I heard the footsteps. They were careful steps, hesitant in the way that belongs only to 3 in the morning. Bare feet on hardwood, pausing at thresholds, uncertain of their destination. I knew it was Elias before I saw him. After 2 years of sharing this small space, I had memorized the rhythm of his movements, the way he navigated our narrow hallway when he thought the world was sleeping. When he appeared in my doorway, I pretended to be asleep. It seemed safer somehow to let him think I couldn't see the way his shoulders curved inward, how his hands trembled against the doorframe. The streetlight from outside caught the pale line of his throat, the mess of dark hair that fell across his forehead. He stood there for what felt like minutes, and I could hear his breathing, shallow and uneven. He asked if I was awake. His voice was smaller than usual, stripped of the easy confidence I had grown accustomed to. I opened my eyes and found his face in the dim light, saw something there I had never seen before. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion so deep it had worn through his usual defenses. He asked if he could sit, and I moved without thinking, making space on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight, and I caught the scent of his skin, warm and familiar in a way that made my chest tight. He didn't explain at first, just sat there with his hands pressed between his knees, staring at the floor. Then he said he had a nightmare. The words came out rough, like they had been scraped from somewhere deep. He didn't offer details, and I didn't ask. Instead, I watched him fold into himself, watched the way his spine curved like he was trying to become smaller, invisible. After a long silence, he asked if he could lie down. Just for a moment, he said, just until he stopped shaking. The request hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift in my chest, a careful wall beginning to crack. I nodded and moved over, giving him room. He settled on top of the covers, fully clothed, keeping a careful distance that felt both respectful and heartbreaking. But then he started trembling again, and without thinking, I reached for him. My arm found its way around his shoulders, pulling him closer. He didn't resist. Instead, he let himself fall against me, his head finding the hollow between my shoulder and chest. I could feel his breath against my collarbone, could count the rapid beat of his heart where it pressed against my ribs. His hair tickled my chin, and I had to fight the urge to run my fingers through it. Everything about the moment felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice that might crack beneath my weight. This was Elias, who brought home women whose perfume lingered in our hallway. Elias, who talked about his future wife with casual certainty, who had never looked at another man the way I had spent 2 years learning not to look at him. Yet here he was, curled against me like a child seeking comfort, trusting me with his vulnerability in a way that made my throat close. I lay there in the darkness, listening to his breathing slow and deepen, feeling the gradual release of tension from his body. His hand had come to rest against my chest, fingers spread over the fabric of my t-shirt, and I wondered if he could feel how hard my heart was beating. Time moved differently in that stillness. Minutes or hours passed, I couldn't tell. All I knew was the weight of him against me, the way he had shaped himself to fit the curve of my body, the dangerous warmth spreading through my chest. I stared at the ceiling and tried to memorize every detail, knowing somehow that this moment would divide my life into before and after. When sleep finally claimed him, his breathing grew steady and deep. His grip on my shirt loosened, but he didn't pull away. If anything, he pressed closer, and I found myself holding my breath, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had brought him to me. I stayed awake until dawn crept through the curtains, painting the room in shades of gray and gold. I stayed awake because I knew that when morning came, we would both pretend this hadn't happened. We would return to our careful dance of shared spaces and unspoken boundaries. But I also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that something fundamental had shifted between us. As the first real light touched his face, I finally understood what I had been afraid to name all these months. This wasn't just attraction or longing. This was love, quiet and patient, and absolutely terrifying. And as Elias stirred against me, his eyes fluttering open in the gentle morning light, I realized that my life had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. That morning, when Elias woke in my arms, he pulled away quickly, mumbling something about being late for class. He avoided my eyes as he gathered himself, straightening clothes that had wrinkled against my body through the night. I watched him retreat to his own room and heard the shower start moments later, the familiar rhythm of his morning routine resuming as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, at least for me. I lay there in the empty bed, still warm from his presence, and tried to reconcile this new reality with the life I had so carefully constructed around my feelings for him. I had become an expert at compartmentalization by necessity. At 28, I had learned to tuck my desires into spaces so small they barely existed. My family back home assumed I was simply too focused on work for relationships, too busy building a career to bother with dating. They weren't entirely wrong. I had thrown myself into the quiet sanctuary of the university library, surrounded by books and silence, cataloging other people's stories while keeping my own locked away. The apartment we shared reflected our different approaches to life. Elias had claimed the larger bedroom, filling it with workout equipment and architectural sketches pinned to every wall. His space buzzed with energy, plans for buildings that would reshape skylines, protein powder containers lined up like soldiers on his dresser. My room was smaller, darker, lined with bookshelves I had built myself from salvaged wood. Where his walls displayed ambition, mine held quiet contemplation. Our shared spaces told the story of two lives learning to coexist. The living room furniture was a collection of mismatched pieces we had accumulated over time. His sleek laptop sat next to my worn paperbacks on the coffee table we had found abandoned on a street corner and carried up 3 flights of stairs together. The kitchen held evidence of our different rhythms. His protein shakes and meal prep containers, my French press, and the ceramic mug I drank from every morning while reading by the window. Elias was everything I wasn't. Where I moved through the world like a shadow, he commanded attention without trying. 26 and built like someone who had never questioned his place in the world, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had always been wanted. Women were drawn to him the way plants turn toward sunlight, instinctively and without reservation. I had grown accustomed to the parade of voices in our hallway. Laura, who left lipstick traces on coffee cups. Michelle, who wore perfume that lingered for days after her visits. Sarah, who called late at night when she had been drinking, her laughter spilling through the thin walls. I learned to recognize them by their footsteps, their different ways of saying his name. Living with Elias meant existing in the space between visibility and invisibility. He would introduce me to his dates with genuine warmth, never making me feel like an inconvenience or afterthought. But I could see the way they looked at me, trying to place me in the landscape of his life. The quiet roommate, the serious one with books instead of ambitions they could understand. What they couldn't see was the intimacy that had developed between us over 2 years of shared mornings and late-night conversations. The way Elias would knock on my door when he couldn't sleep, asking to borrow another book even though he rarely finished the ones I gave him. How we had developed our own language of comfortable silences, could exist in the same space for hours without feeling the need to fill the quiet with words. I had watched him struggle through difficult semesters, seen him doubt himself in moments when his usual confidence cracked. I knew he missed his family more than he admitted, that he called his mother every Sunday, but never told her about the loneliness that sometimes overwhelmed him in this city where he was building his future. I knew he was afraid of heights despite choosing a career that would require him to stand atop half-finished skyscrapers, that he still slept with a fan running because silence made him anxious. In return, he knew things about me that I had never shared with another person, that I wrote poetry in the margins of library books when I thought no one was watching, that my parents still sent care packages filled with my mother's cookies, even though I was nearly 30, that I had once wanted to teach literature but lost my nerve during graduate school, choosing the safety of cataloging other people's words instead of sharing my own. We had built something together in this small apartment, something that existed in the spaces between friendship and something deeper. I had learned to live within those boundaries, to find satisfaction in the moments when he would fall asleep on our couch during movie nights, his head heavy against my shoulder. I had taught myself to be grateful for the casual touches, the way he would rest his hand on my back when reaching around me in the kitchen, the brief moments when he would hug me goodbye before trips home to see his family. For 2 years, I had believed this was enough. The careful friendship, the shared domestic rhythms, the privilege of knowing him in ways his dates never would. I had convinced myself that wanting more was selfish, that the love I felt for him was something to be managed rather than expressed. But that night had shattered the careful equilibrium we had maintained. The weight of his body against mine, the trust he had placed in me when his defenses were down, the way he had sought comfort in my arms, had changed everything. The boundaries I had so carefully maintained suddenly felt artificial, arbitrary. As I heard him moving around the apartment that morning, getting ready for class, I realized that I could no longer pretend our connection was purely platonic. The way he had clung to me in the darkness, the relief I had felt at being able to offer him comfort, the rightness of holding him, had awakened something in me that refused to be put back to sleep. I got up and began my own morning routine, making coffee and settling into my usual chair by the window with a book I wouldn't be able to focus on. But I was hyper-aware of every sound he made, every movement in the apartment we had shared for so long. When he appeared in the kitchen, freshly showered and ready to face the day, I looked up from my book and tried to read his expression. He seemed determined to act normal, pouring himself coffee and checking his phone with the same casual efficiency he displayed every morning. But I caught him glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, and I wondered if he was remembering the same things I couldn't stop thinking about. The way we had fit together so naturally, the peace that had settled over his face as he fell asleep in my arms, the moment when everything I had been hiding became impossible to deny. For 3 days, we performed the elaborate dance of pretending that night had never happened. Elias threw himself back into his routines with determined normalcy. I would hear him leaving for the gym at dawn, his footsteps purposeful in the hallway. He turned his music up louder than usual while he worked on his architectural models, filling the apartment with the kind of energy that felt like armor against quieter thoughts. The women started calling again. I recognized Michelle's laugh through his closed door, heard him making plans for dinner dates and weekend trips. He was rebuilding the life I had watched him live for 2 years, but there was something frantic about it now, something that felt like running. I retreated into my own patterns of avoidance. Extra hours at the library, books that demanded complete attention, anything to avoid the moments when we might find ourselves alone together in the apartment. When our paths did cross, we were polite, careful, like strangers who shared the same address. But avoidance is exhausting, and our apartment was too small for 2 people determined not to see each other. By the 4th evening, the careful distance we had maintained began to collapse under its own weight. I was reading in my room when I heard his footsteps pause outside my door. Not the hurried steps of someone passing by, but the deliberate stop of someone gathering courage. He knocked, a soft sound that somehow carried more weight than words. When I opened the door, he was holding one of my books, the copy of Neruda I had lent him months ago. He said he wanted to return it, but instead of handing it over, he lingered in the doorway, his fingers turning the pages like he was searching for something specific. He asked about a particular poem, the one about love being so short and forgetting so long. As I explained the metaphor, I watched his face, saw the way he was listening not just to my words but to something beneath them. When I finished talking, he didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the edge of my bed and asked if I had any other books like that one. That became our new routine. Evening visits that started with borrowed books but evolved into something more substantial. He would appear at my door with questions about poetry, about the novels that lined my shelves, about the marginalia I had written in books I thought no one else would ever read. We talked about stories and their meanings, about characters who loved in ways that society didn't understand, about the space between what people said and what they meant. One night, he brought beer from the refrigerator and settled into my reading chair like he belonged there. We talked until nearly midnight about a novel where the protagonist spent decades loving someone who couldn't love him back. Elias asked if I thought that kind of devotion was noble or self-destructive. I told him I thought it was probably both. During the day, nothing changed. He still left for the gym, still worked on his projects with focused intensity, still made plans with women whose names I collected like unwanted souvenirs. But the evenings had become ours, and I found myself anticipating the sound of his knock, the way he would settle into my space like he was testing how it felt to belong there. Then, nearly 2 weeks after that first night, he appeared in my doorway without a book, without an excuse. His face held the same pale exhaustion I remembered, the same careful vulnerability that had brought him to me before. He said the nightmares had come back. This time, he didn't apologize or explain. He simply asked if he could stay, and I moved aside to make room for him on the bed. This time felt different. There was no pretense of it being temporary, no promise that it would only be for a moment. He settled beside me with a familiarity that suggested he had been thinking about this, planning for it. When I put my arm around him, he didn't tense or hesitate. Instead, he moved closer, fitting himself against me like he was returning to a place he remembered. We talked in whispers about small things. He told me about a building he was designing for class, how he wanted to create spaces that felt like safety. I told him about a poet whose work I had been cataloging, someone who wrote about love as a form of recognition, the moment when you see yourself reflected in another person's eyes. When he fell asleep, his hand was resting on my chest, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. But I stayed awake longer this time, not from anxiety, but from a growing certainty that this was becoming something neither of us had planned, but both of us needed. It happened again 3 nights later, and then a week after that. Each time, he would appear with the same quiet desperation, the same unspoken request. Each time, I would make space for him, and we would settle into an intimacy that felt both innocent and profound. The nightmares became our excuse, but I began to suspect they were as much symptom as cause. Something in him was waking up, just as something in me was refusing to stay buried. The careful boundaries we had maintained for 2 years were dissolving, replaced by this new ritual of closeness that we couldn't name but couldn't resist. I started to notice changes in how he looked at me during our shared mornings. Glances that lasted longer than necessary, moments when he would start to say something and then stop himself. Once, I caught him staring at me while I made coffee, and when our eyes met, he didn't look away immediately. Instead, he held my gaze for a heartbeat longer than friendship required, and I felt something pass between us that had nothing to do with nightmares or comfort. He was still dating, still maintaining the life he had built before, but I could see the cracks forming in his certainty. The way he would cancel plans at the last minute, claiming exhaustion. The way he would end phone calls more quickly, as if the conversations that had once energized him now felt hollow. Meanwhile, I was changing too. The careful restraint I had cultivated for years was becoming harder to maintain. When he lay beside me in the darkness, I found myself memorizing the feel of his hair against my cheek, the weight of his arm across my chest, the way he breathed my name in his sleep. I was falling deeper into something I had spent years trying to avoid, and I was no longer sure I wanted to stop myself. Our apartment had become a place divided by daylight and darkness. In the day, we were roommates, careful and respectful of the boundaries that defined our friendship. But at night, when the rest of the world disappeared, we became something else entirely. Something that felt dangerous and necessary and absolutely inevitable. Each time he came to me, each time I held him through the dark hours, I felt us moving closer to a line that, once crossed, would change everything we thought we knew about ourselves and each other. Our nights developed a rhythm as natural as breathing. I would read by the small lamp beside my bed, waiting without admitting I was waiting, listening for the familiar sounds that meant he was struggling to sleep. The creaking of his bed frame as he tossed and turned, the soft patting of his feet across the hallway, the hesitant pause outside my door before he finally knocked. Sometimes he would arrive within an hour of his usual bedtime, already defeated by thoughts that wouldn't quiet. Other times, he would fight it until nearly dawn, and I would hear him moving restlessly through the apartment, making tea he wouldn't drink, starting architectural drawings he wouldn't finish. But eventually, inevitably, he would come to me. The nightmares were real, I knew that. But I also began to understand that they were becoming less about sleep and more about permission. Permission to seek the comfort he couldn't ask for in daylight. Permission to cross the boundaries that defined our careful friendship. Permission to need me in a way that terrified us both. We learned to navigate this new intimacy like cartographers mapping unknown territory. Some nights we would talk in whispers about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in a small town where everyone knew his family, how the pressure to be the golden boy had followed him even here. I shared stories about my childhood obsession with books, how I had hidden in libraries to escape a world that felt too loud, too demanding. One night, he asked about my family, why I never talked about dating, whether I was lonely. The question hung in the darkness between us, and I found myself telling him things I had never said aloud. How I had learned early that my desires didn't match the script I was supposed to follow. How I had chosen invisibility over vulnerability, safety over truth. He listened without judgment, his breathing steady against my chest, and when I finished talking, he said he understood feeling different, feeling like he was performing a version of himself that everyone expected but that didn't quite fit. We didn't name what we were dancing around, but the conversation created a new kind of closeness between us, an understanding that we were both carrying secrets. Other nights, words felt unnecessary. We would lie together in the soft lamplight, and the silence would speak louder than any conversation. I would feel the gradual relaxation of his body against mine, the way his breathing would slow and deepen, the trust implicit in how completely he allowed himself to be held. Those were the nights that undid me completely, when the simple act of existing together felt like the most profound intimacy I had ever experienced. I began to notice changes in how he looked at me, not just during our nighttime encounters, but throughout our shared days. Glances that lingered a moment too long when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way his eyes would follow me as I moved through our kitchen in the morning. How he would sometimes stop mid-sentence when our conversations touched on anything too personal, as if he was catching himself before saying something that couldn't be taken back. There was a morning when I was reading at the kitchen table, and he came out of his room wearing only pajama pants, hair still messy from sleep. He moved to make coffee, and I felt his presence like electricity in the air. When he leaned past me to reach a mug from the cabinet, his bare shoulder brushed against mine, and neither of us moved away immediately. The contact lasted only seconds, but it felt deliberate, loaded with intention. He asked what I was reading, and when I showed him the poetry collection I had been working through, he sat down across from me and asked me to read something aloud. I chose a poem about longing, about the space between desire and fulfillment, and as I read, I could feel his attention focused entirely on me. When I finished, he asked me to read it again, and this time I looked up to find him watching my mouth form the words. The moment stretched between us, charged with possibility, before he abruptly stood and said he was going to be late for class. But as he gathered his things, I caught him looking at me in the reflection of the hallway mirror, and I realized something fundamental was shifting in how he saw me. During the day, he still maintained his other life. Sarah had become a more frequent presence, staying over on weekends, leaving traces of herself in our shared spaces. I would find her hair elastic on the bathroom counter, smell her perfume on the couch cushions, hear her laughter through his bedroom wall. But even as he continued this relationship, I could sense his growing distraction. I would catch him staring out windows during conversations with her, see how he would check his phone less frequently when she texted, notice the way he would end their evenings earlier, claiming exhaustion or early morning commitments. Once, I overheard her asking if something was wrong, if he was having second thoughts about their relationship. His response was vague, reassuring, but unconvincing. Meanwhile, I found myself changing in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. For years, I had lived in the shadows of my own life, accepting that my desires were something to be managed rather than pursued. But our nighttime intimacy was awakening something in me that refused to be contained. I began to imagine possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. What it might feel like to be seen completely, to be wanted for exactly who I was rather than who I pretended to be. I started noticing my reflection differently, seeing myself through eyes that might find me attractive rather than simply acceptable. I bought new clothes, not dramatically different, but somehow more intentional. I found myself laughing more easily, speaking up in conversations at work, taking up space in ways that felt foreign but exhilarating. Elias noticed these changes. He commented on a new shirt, complimented my haircut, told me I seemed happier lately. His attention to these details felt significant, like he was studying me, trying to understand what had shifted in my demeanor. But it was in the darkness of my bedroom that the most profound transformation was occurring. Night after night, as I held him through his restless dreams, I felt him unraveling in my arms. The confident, certain young man I had lived with for 2 years was revealing depths of uncertainty and vulnerability that he showed to no one else. He would sometimes whisper confessions into the darkness, doubts about his career, fears about his future, questions about whether the life he was building was actually the one he wanted. He told me about feeling like he was sleepwalking through relationships that should have meant more to him, about the growing sense that he was becoming someone he didn't recognize. One night, he asked me if I ever felt like I was living the wrong life, like I had taken a path that led away from who I was supposed to be. The question felt like a confession, and I told him that I had felt that way for most of my adult life, until recently. When he asked what had changed, I couldn't answer honestly without revealing too much, so I simply said that sometimes the right life finds you when you're not looking for it. These conversations were changing us both. I could see it in the way he carried himself during the day, a new uncertainty in his usually confident stride. The easy answers he had always relied on were becoming questions, and I could tell it frightened him. He was someone who had always defined himself through certainty, through knowing exactly what he wanted and how to get it. But our nighttime intimacy was introducing doubt into his carefully constructed worldview. As for me, I was learning what it felt like to be essential to someone else's peace. For the first time in my life, I was not just wanted but needed, not just accepted but cherished. The way he sought me out when the world became too much, the relief that would cross his face when I made space for him in my bed, the complete trust with which he allowed himself to be vulnerable in my presence. All of this was teaching me that love was not just something I felt, but something I could inspire. We were creating something together in those dark hours, something that existed outside the rules and expectations that governed our daylight lives. Our apartment after midnight had become a sanctuary where we could explore who we might be if we were brave enough to stop pretending, if we were willing to risk everything we thought we knew about ourselves for the possibility of something real. But with each passing night, the weight of our secret was becoming harder to bear. The tenderness that bloomed between us in darkness was becoming impossible to completely hide during the day. We were walking a tightrope between revelation and concealment, and I could feel us both growing tired of the balance. It happened on a Tuesday night in late August. I remember the date because earlier that day, Sarah had called 3 times before Elias finally answered. I had heard pieces of their conversation through the thin walls, her voice rising in frustration, his responses growing shorter and more defensive. By evening, the apartment felt charged with unresolved tension. I was reading in bed when I heard his door slam, followed by the sounds of him pacing in his room. His footsteps were different that night, agitated rather than restless. I heard drawers opening and closing, the scrape of his chair being moved across the floor. Whatever conversation he had had with Sarah had left him raw in a way I had rarely seen. When he appeared in my doorway, I knew immediately that something was wrong. His face was pale, almost gray in the lamplight, and his hands were trembling more violently than I had ever seen. He didn't knock this time, didn't ask permission. He simply stood there, looking lost in a way that made my chest tighten with concern. He said he couldn't sleep, but there was something different in his voice, something that went deeper than the usual nightmares. When I moved aside to make room for him, he hesitated for the first time in weeks, as if he was suddenly aware of what he was asking for, what this had become. But the hesitation lasted only a moment before he crossed the threshold and settled beside me. This time, he didn't lie down immediately. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed with his back to me, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to protect himself from something I couldn't see. I asked if he wanted to talk about it, and he shook his head. Then, after a long silence, he asked if I thought it was possible to want something so much that it scared you into denying it existed. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I told him I thought fear could make people do all kinds of things they later regretted, including running from the very things that might save them. He turned to look at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, a kind of desperate recognition that made my breath catch. He finally lay down, but instead of settling immediately into sleep, he remained tense beside me. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could sense the war being fought just beneath his skin. When I put my arm around him, he didn't relax into it the way he usually did. Instead, he seemed to hold himself apart, as if he was afraid of what might happen if he let go completely. We lay there in the darkness for what felt like hours, both of us pretending to seek sleep that wouldn't come. I could feel his breathing, irregular and shallow, could sense him fighting against something that wanted to surface. The silence between us felt different that night, weighted with words that neither of us knew how to speak. Then, without warning, he turned to face me. In the dim light filtering through my curtains, I could see his eyes, wide and searching, studying my face like he was trying to memorize it. We were closer than we had ever been while both awake, close enough that I could feel his breath against my lips, could count the dark lashes that framed his eyes. The question came as a whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Why does this feel different with you? The words cut through the silence like a blade, exposing the truth we had been dancing around for weeks. I couldn't answer. How could I explain that everything felt different with him, that he had changed the fundamental temperature of my world simply by existing in it? How could I tell him that what we had created in these dark hours was the most real thing I had ever experienced, without revealing how much I needed it to continue? Our faces were inches apart, and I could see my own confusion and longing reflected in his eyes. The moment stretched between us, taut with possibility and terror, and I felt as if we were standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether we learned to fly or simply fell. Then he moved closer, so slowly that I could have stopped him, could have turned away, could have pretended I didn't understand what was happening. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Instead, I watched his eyes drift closed as he leaned forward, watched his lips part slightly as they found mine. The kiss was everything and nothing like I had imagined. It was desperate and tentative at the same time, filled with weeks of suppressed longing and the terror of finally acknowledging what we had both been feeling. His lips were soft, warm, trembling against mine with a vulnerability that made my heart race. I could taste his fear, his need, his confusion, all mixed together in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. It lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched like hours, like years, like a lifetime of possibility condensed into a single point of contact. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, some last wall finally crumbling under the weight of what I could no longer deny. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Elias pulled back as if he had been burned, his eyes wide with horror at what he had done. He scrambled away from me, pressing himself against the far edge of the bed, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. The apologies began immediately, tumbling out of him in a rush of shame and regret. He said he didn't know what had come over him, that he wasn't thinking clearly, that he had never done anything like that before. Each word felt like a small knife, cutting away at the beautiful thing we had just created together. I tried to reach for him, to tell him it was okay, that he didn't need to apologize for something I had wanted just as much. But he flinched away from my touch like it burned, his face twisted with self-loathing that broke my heart. He said he needed to go, that this was wrong, that he couldn't understand why he had done something so stupid. Before I could respond, he was off the bed and moving toward the door, fleeing from the room like he was escaping a crime scene. I called his name, but he didn't stop. I heard his bedroom door slam, heard the lock turn, heard the sound of his back sliding down the door until he hit the floor. Through the thin walls, I could hear him breathing heavily, could almost feel his panic radiating through the apartment. I lay there in my empty bed, my lips still tingling from his kiss, my heart still racing from the enormity of what had just happened. The kiss itself had lasted only moments, but I knew it had changed everything between us. There was no going back to the careful friendship we had maintained, no pretending that what we felt for each other was purely platonic. But Elias's reaction had made it clear that he wasn't ready to face what the kiss meant, wasn't prepared to acknowledge the feelings that had driven him to me night after night. The shame in his voice, the horror in his eyes, told me that he was going to retreat as far and as fast as he could from what we had almost become. I stared at the ceiling for the rest of the night, listening to the sounds of him moving restlessly in his room, knowing that he was just as sleepless as I was, but for different reasons. Where I felt awakened, he felt terrified. Where I felt hopeful, he felt ashamed. Where I saw possibility, he saw only complication and confusion. The kiss had revealed the truth we had both been hiding from, but it had also shown me how far apart we still were in our ability to accept that truth. Elias was not ready to be the person who wanted what we had shared, was not prepared to dismantle the identity he had spent years constructing. As dawn approached, I realized that our nighttime sanctuary had been destroyed by the very intimacy it had been building toward. The kiss that should have been a beginning felt instead like an ending, like the moment when our beautiful secret finally collapsed under the weight of its own impossibility. When morning came, I knew everything would be different. The question was whether different meant we would finally find a way to be honest with each other, or whether Elias would run so far from what had happened that we might never find our way back to each other at all. The silence that followed was worse than any argument we might have had. For 5 days, Elias moved through our apartment like a ghost haunting his own life. He left earlier in the mornings, came home later in the evenings, and when our paths did cross, he couldn't meet my eyes. I watched him throw himself into distractions with a desperation that was painful to witness. He spent hours at the gym, returning home exhausted but still restless. His architectural projects consumed him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I would hear him working late into the night, the scratch of pencils on paper, the frustrated sounds of designs being crumpled and discarded. Sarah came by twice during those days, and I could hear the confusion in her voice as she tried to understand his sudden distance. Their conversations were stilted, full of long pauses where easy words used to flow. The second time she visited, I heard her ask directly if he was seeing someone else. His denial was immediate but unconvincing, even to me. The weight of our unspoken truth pressed against every interaction. We had created something beautiful in the darkness of my room, something that the harsh light of day had revealed as more fragile than either of us had imagined. The kiss had torn away the pretense that what we shared was purely friendship, but it had also shown us how unprepared we were to face what lay beneath. I tried to give him space, tried to let him process what had happened without the pressure of my presence. But our apartment was too small for true avoidance, and I could feel his struggle radiating through the walls. Every sound he made carried weight. The way he slammed cabinet doors spoke of frustration. The way he paced his room late at night spoke of a mind that couldn't find rest. On the 6th day, I heard him break. It was past midnight when his bedroom door opened with enough force to hit the wall. His footsteps in the hallway weren't the careful, hesitant steps I had grown accustomed to, but the urgent stride of someone who had run out of ways to run from himself. When he appeared in my doorway, I barely recognized him. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He looked like someone who had been fighting a war and finally realized he was losing. There was a wildness in his expression that I had never seen before, a desperation that went beyond the nightmares that had originally brought him to me. He didn't ask permission this time. He stepped into my room and began pacing like a caged animal, his hands running through his hair, his breathing sharp and irregular. I sat up in bed, alarmed by the intensity of his distress, and asked what was wrong. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, and I saw something raw and exposed in his expression that made my chest tighten. He said the nightmares had gotten worse, but then he stopped himself, shook his head, and said that wasn't true. They hadn't gotten worse, they had gotten clearer. He told me they were always about drowning, about being pulled under by something he couldn't fight, couldn't escape, couldn't even see clearly. He would wake up gasping, feeling like his lungs were full of water, but it wasn't the drowning that terrified him. It was the moment in the dream when he stopped fighting, when he let himself sink and felt relief instead of fear. The confession hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning that went far beyond sleep and dreams. I could see him struggling with the metaphor he had just revealed, the way his own subconscious had been trying to tell him something he wasn't ready to hear. He sat down heavily on the edge of my bed, his head in his hands, and said he didn't understand what was happening to him, that everything he thought he knew about himself was falling apart, and he couldn't make sense of the pieces. He said being near me was the only thing that quieted the fear, but that realization terrified him more than any nightmare. I watched him unravel in front of me, watched years of carefully constructed certainty crumble under the weight of feelings he couldn't name or control. This was Elias as I had never seen him, stripped of his easy confidence, forced to confront parts of himself he had never allowed to surface. He looked up at me then, his eyes desperate and searching, and asked if I understood what he was trying to say. The question was both plea and challenge, asking me to help him make sense of something that defied the logic he had always relied on. That was the moment when I broke too. After years of carefully guarded silence, after weeks of pretending that what we shared was anything other than love, after days of watching him torture himself with shame and confusion, I couldn't hold back the truth any longer. I told him that I understood perfectly, that I had been drowning too, for much longer than he had, in feelings I had never been allowed to express, that I had wanted more from the very beginning, had always wanted more, but had learned to be grateful for whatever closeness he could offer without asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam. I told him about the years of careful restraint, the nights I had lain awake after he went back to his own room, the way I had taught myself to love him quietly, invisibly, safely. I told him that what he was feeling wasn't wrong or broken or something to be ashamed of, but rather the most natural thing in the world. His face went through a series of expressions as I spoke. Surprise, recognition, fear, and something that might have been relief. When I finished, the room fell into a silence that felt different from all the silences that had come before. This one wasn't heavy with unspoken truths, but rather with truths that had finally been given voice. He said my name, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, and there was something broken and beautiful in the way he spoke it. He said he had been afraid that what he was feeling was one-sided, that he was imposing his confusion on someone who saw their relationship as purely friendship. The idea that I had been carrying the same secret, the same longing, seemed to shift something fundamental in how he saw himself. But then the fear returned to his eyes, and he said he didn't know what any of this meant, didn't know how to reconcile the feelings we had admitted with the life he had spent years building. He talked about his family, their expectations, the future he had planned that didn't include room for the truth we had just spoken. I watched him wrestle with the choice that lay before him. I could see the war being fought behind his eyes, between the person he had always been and the person he might become if he was brave enough to stop running from what he felt. It was a choice between safety and truth, between the life everyone expected him to live and the life that might actually make him happy. The moment stretched between us, fragile and infinite, everything balanced on the edge of what he would choose to do with the truth we had finally shared. I knew I couldn't make the choice for him, couldn't force him to be ready for something that required courage he might not yet possess. But I also knew that this was the moment when everything would be decided. Whether we would find a way to be honest about what we felt for each other, or whether the weight of expectation and fear would drive him back into the safety of denial. Whether the love we had discovered in the darkness would survive being brought into the light, or whether it would wither under the pressure of a world that might not understand. The silence that followed contained every possibility and every fear, every hope and every doubt. In that moment, suspended between confession and decision, we both understood that our lives were about to change forever, one way or another. 3 weeks passed before we found our way back to each other. The days immediately following our confrontation were careful, tentative. We moved through our shared spaces like people learning to walk again, testing each step, uncertain of the ground beneath our feet. Elias didn't retreat the way he had after the kiss, but he didn't move forward either. Instead, we existed in a kind of suspended animation, both of us processing what we had admitted, what it meant, what came next. I watched him end things with Sarah. It happened gradually, then all at once. Fewer phone calls, canceled dates, conversations that grew shorter and more distant until they stopped altogether. When she came by one last time to collect things she had left in his room, I heard her ask what had changed, what she had done wrong. His response was quiet, honest in its way. He told her she hadn't done anything wrong, that he was the one who had changed, that he needed to figure out who he was before he could be fair to anyone else. The apartment grew quieter after that. Elias stopped bringing people home, stopped maintaining the social calendar that had once defined his weekends. Instead, he spent more time in our shared spaces, reading books I recommended, cooking elaborate meals he would invite me to share, working on architectural projects at the kitchen table where I could see his careful attention to detail. We talked more during those weeks, but carefully, about safe subjects that didn't require us to navigate the new landscape of acknowledged feelings. He told me about his childhood fear of deep water, how he had nearly drowned as a boy and had spent years afterward afraid to swim. I shared stories about learning to be invisible, about the relief and loneliness of a life lived in shadows. Slowly, we began to trust each other with the truth of who we were becoming. Not the people we had been, not the people others expected us to be, but the people we might be if we were brave enough to stop pretending. Then, on a Thursday night in September, everything shifted again. I was reading in bed when I heard his footsteps in the hallway, but they were different this time. Not urgent or desperate, not hesitant or ashamed. Just the steady steps of someone who had made a decision and was no longer afraid of it. When he appeared in my doorway, I saw a version of Elias I had never encountered before. Calm, certain, at peace with whatever had brought him to me. He didn't ask permission or offer explanations. He simply said my name, a question and a statement wrapped together, and I understood. I moved aside, making space for him as I had so many times before. But this time felt different from all the others. There was no pretense about nightmares or need for comfort, no apologies or shame. This was a choice being made freely, clearly, without the weight of secrecy or denial. He settled beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin, and for the first time in weeks, the tension I had been carrying in my chest began to ease. We lay there in the soft lamplight, not speaking, simply existing together in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. After a while, he reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture so simple and so profound that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. It was an acknowledgement, a claiming, a quiet declaration that we belonged to each other in ways that went beyond words. We didn't talk about what this meant for our future, didn't make plans or promises or dramatic declarations of love. Instead, we simply breathed together in the darkness, two people who had finally stopped running from the truth of what they felt. I could hear the city beyond our windows, the distant sounds of traffic and late-night conversations, the world continuing its busy existence while we lay cocooned in our small apartment, in my small room, in the space we had created for this love to grow. Elias shifted closer, resting his head against my shoulder, and I felt the last of his resistance dissolve. This wasn't the desperate clinging of someone seeking comfort from nightmares, but the peaceful settling of someone who had found where he belonged. I closed my eyes, not because I was tired, but because for the first time in my life, I felt completely held. Not as a secret to be hidden, not as something shameful or wrong, but as something true and valuable and worth choosing. Outside, the city slept. Inside, we breathed in rhythm. Two men who had found their way to each other through the darkness, who had learned that love was not something to be feared, but something to be claimed, quietly, bravely, completely. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain in its details, but clear in its direction. We would have to navigate a world that might not understand what we had found together, would have to learn how to be these new versions of ourselves. But in that moment, those challenges felt distant, manageable, small compared to the magnitude of what we had discovered. I listened to Elias's breathing slow and deepen as sleep finally claimed him, felt the weight of his trust in the way he relaxed completely against me. And I knew that whatever came next, whatever we had to face, we would face it together. This was not an ending, but a beginning, not a conclusion, but a recognition. We had stopped pretending to be anything other than what we were. Two people who had found in each other something worth risking everything for, something true enough to build a life around. In the quiet darkness of my room, holding the man I loved, I finally understood what it meant to be home.